The 1960s started off with the brutal death of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. The young president was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, while in the back of a convertible during a parade next to his beloved wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. Jackie recalls the tragic events in an interview done by press member Glenn Johnson. She states, quote, "I kept saying, 'Jack, Jack, Jack,' and someone was yelling, 'He's dead, he's dead.' All the ride to the hospital, I kept bending over him saying, 'Jack, Jack, can you hear me? I love you, Jack,'" end quote. While Kennedy's death was horrific and tragic for his wife Jackie, the rest of the country felt the reparations as well. Shortly after Kennedy's death, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States. Johnson aided the country in solving various domestic issues that Kennedy had not, including civil rights laws and the Great Society program. Additionally, JFK's death and Johnson's presidency resulted in a change in the U.S. foreign policy regarding Vietnam and the country's involvement. Johnson's era, however, ended in 1968 while a new one began.
Prior to his presidential campaign, Kennedy was very involved in United States politics. He worked for the U.S. Department of Criminal Justice, led JFK's senatorial campaign, joined the Senate's Subcommittee on Investigations, and more. He then tried to move up his position in the government and re-establish the ideas of John F. Kennedy by running for president in the election following the end of Johnson's, or what would have been his brother's, term. Throughout the campaign, Kennedy, with no surprise, became the favorite out of the political parties. Just as he was ensuring his victory in June of 1968, he was assassinated, leaving a very devastated and perplexed America behind.
The election was very difficult for the Democratic side. Lyndon B. Johnson was the obvious front-runner for the Democratic election, but the rallies of college students and urban protests weakened his running. When Bobby Kennedy entered into the Democratic election, Lyndon B. Johnson decided to drop out of the race due to his vulnerability. Tragically, on June 19, 1968, in Los Angeles, California, the world was shocked when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Even through the pain, the election was still happening between former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, running for the Democratic side, and Nixon for the Republican side. Nixon was actually very successful and won the silent majority. He ended up winning the election, and the U.S. had a leader once again.
Shockingly, just as America was regaining its pride, the country suffered another loss.
In late January 1968, the people of South Vietnam busily prepare for the traditional holiday of Tet, marking the Lunar New Year. Civilians decorate their shops and homes, and the military looks forward to a brief ceasefire, with many ARVN soldiers taking leave as the country celebrates. Communist insurgents are preparing for something different, however. North Vietnam chooses the ceasefire as the time to launch the General Uprising, a massive coordinated offensive targeting every major base and urban area in South Vietnam. Viet Cong guerrillas prepare and
The
mobilize.
media attacked the United States for letting this happen to our country, and some Americans began to question their decision on our newly sworn-in President Nixon. Protests began to rise due to the anger and embarrassment the U.S. went through because of Vietnam. The desire for change brought two issues into one. In addition to the uproar caused by America's involvement in Vietnam, protests broke out within the country due to civil rights issues. Two important leaders of the movement, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., were suddenly and horrifically assassinated in the 1960s. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was shot by members of the Nation of Islam in Washington Heights, New York, during one of his several speeches. The conspiracy behind his death has to do with him disagreeing with another strong political power, Elijah Muhammad. MLK was shot on April 24, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. After one of his rallies became violent, King returned back to his room, and it was on that balcony that he was killed by a sniper. The deaths of these two heroic leaders resulted in much hope being lost for members of their movements, and it impacted how the civil rights movement would continue. More than ever, American citizens needed some type of leader they could trust, since all of their role models were being taken away from them.
On August 28th, protesters and police got into a bloody fight outside the convention center. 8 protesters were charged with conspiracy: Abby Hoffman, Renee Davis, John Froines, Tom Hayden, Lee Weiner, David Dellinger, Jerry Rubin, and Bobby Seale. The prosecutors were believed to be in groups such as the SDS, YIP, and Black Panthers. The protests were held at the DNC to protest not only the Vietnam War but the Democratic Party, especially Lyndon B. Johnson. Ignoring Mayor Richard Daley's warnings to stay away, thousands of anti-war demonstrators descended on Chicago to oppose the Democratic administration's Vietnam policy. It was said to be a part of conspiracy that from on April 12, 1968 through August 24, 1968, the defendants David T. Dellinger, Renard C. Davis, Thomas E. Hayden, Abbott H. Hoffman, and Jerry C. Rubin planned to organize and attend meetings, publish and cause to be published articles, and make long-distance telephone calls to encourage people to come to Chicago, Illinois to take part in these massive protests. Bobby Seale defended himself without counsel and spent 3 days in court. His case was later declared a mistrial. The jury found 5 of the 8 defendants guilty of crossing state lines to riot, but these convictions were reversed on appeal. They were charged by the federal government with conspiracy of inciting to riot and attempts to protest against anti-Vietnam War.
What do you remember seeing or reading in the paper or TV about the Vietnam War?
In my opinion, I think it was a very unjustified war that we should have got into, because North and South Vietnam fought for ages, and we went in there to try to think we could fix the problem, and I don't think the problem's ever been solved.
Yeah. So you didn't agree with JFK's policies and actions during the Vietnam War, right?
I agree that once we committed to helping them, that we wanted to see it through, and we did. It cost us a lot of lives. I go back further from when we were in the Korean War, when this goes back into the late 40s, when General MacArthur said we should keep moving up Cambodia and solve the problem there. It was around 1948, 1950. And Harry S. Truman, who was the president, fired him. And I think General MacArthur was one of the greatest generals we ever had.
What do you remember seeing or reading on the TV or paper or anything about the Vietnam War?
Well, I remember the turmoil, and there were a lot of anti-war protesters. I remember President Johnson decided not to run again. We came into a very bad year of 1968, where Martin Luther King was shot, Robert Kennedy was shot. So this was the year that we were going to be electing a new president, and those 2 very important people died. Were assassinated, actually. Edward Humphrey, who was Johnson's vice president, got the nomination then to run against Richard Nixon. And Nixon won. But they had the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968 that nominated, Humphrey. And there were tremendous riots, awful riots. I'm pretty sure it was Chicago. And they had horrible riots, and because of the war situation, they wanted the war to end. And there was not young people did not want to go to that war, because they did not feel we were justified being there. It was going to be a war that, after our success in World War II, Americans idealized the fact that we would always win, we'd always be number one, and we would win every war we would go into. But this was proving wrong, because we weren't winning that war, and we didn't win it.
The foreign affairs of the Vietnam War led to domestic affairs throughout the United States. This led to a much-needed change in leadership in all areas. The 60s not only were very hard due to the deaths of many world-renowned leaders, but also very controversial. Citizens were divided on civil rights issues and the Vietnam War involvement, resulting in riots and protests that weakened the unity of the nation overall.